Hi, this is Troy Torres with Kandit News. I have an update of the past 4 hours of testimony from Henry Alvendia, and actually a couple of those hours, while he's still on the stand, the exhibits that they're going over were 2 hours of video and audio recordings that of Henry Alvendia as a government agent, going undercover for the federal government, having conversations with Raymond Martinez and Juanita Moser, and they were not aware of those conversations at the time. And this is the central piece of the government's conspiracy charge against the couple, and the conspiracy to transport methamphetamine, bring it to Guam, basically, is in simple terms, it would be an agreement between at least 2 people in the commission of a crime. And so what the government is trying to show is that Raymond Martinez and Juanita Moser agreed together and planned to execute the distribution of methamphetamine on Guam. Now, where things get complicated are things that happen in the suppression hearings, which are the pre-trial hearings, the motions that you make before a judge, before a trial starts, before a jury is selected, and that's to discuss matters of law. So during the suppression hearings, the Martinez Moser defense team argued entrapment, that the federal government entrapped the couple, and I'll get to that definition in just a second. What the couple has left is an entrapment defense, since the judge did not suppress evidence during the pretrial motions, based on the arguments that both the defense and the prosecution made at the time. So entrapment, it is a legal term that goes back to 1932 when the U.S. Supreme Court in Sorrell versus United States first laid the groundwork for entrapment, and the 2 original elements of that Supreme Court ruling are the 2 central elements of the entrapment defense that exist today. And number 1, the first test of it is that you were entrapped only if you can have an entrapment defense only if, number 1, you are not predisposed to commit that crime. Meaning, you look at things like the history of the person. Do they have a criminal history? Were they suspected in the distribution of drugs, if the entrapment defense is for drugs? And then the second one is on the conduct of the government itself, the conduct of law enforcement officers. Did they do things to induce otherwise citizens of good moral character and good standing to do things that they would not normally do had you not convinced them to do that crime? So it's the Supreme Court's way of saying we need to prevent crime and not to help create crime. And that goes back all the way to 1932. And then there are other tests that go along with that. But if you withstand those 2 tests, then generally you have an entrapment defense, which means, basically you can walk free even though the government has charged you with these crimes. Even if you were actually planning to go forward with those crimes, if you have an entrapment defense that works, then it's not your fault, it is the government's fault that happened in the first place. That's basically what the law says. So Mr. Alvendia took the stand and he answered a bunch of questions from Mr. Black, the prosecutor. And of course the first few questions were all about who he is, and they went over some of his shortcomings at customs and how he became to be the mastermind, or so the federal government says, of the largest police corruption case in the history of the island. So after that, Mr. Black brings Mr. Alvendia into his days at Ralphie's, which was a bar in Agania, and it's what connects Mr. Alvendia to not just his former boss, Ralph Scambaluri, who we've learned recently was the real focus of the customs corruption scandal, but also links him to Raymond Martinez and Juanita Moser, which is the place where they met sometime around 2008 or 2009, according to Mr. Alvendia. He said the significance of these dates is and how they came to be friends, and that law enforcement officers frequented Ralphie's is because he says that either in late 2012 or early 2013, he had a conversation with Raymond Martinez and Juanita Moser, and in that conversation, he claims that Raymond Martinez and Juanita Moser were the two who brought up the subject of using Mr. Alvendia's position to smuggle drugs into Guam. And so, as part of the conspiracy charge, the government has said that it's important, or that the reason that this 2012 or 2013 meeting is important is because it lays the groundwork for crimes that have been committed or attempted to have been committed over a period of time. And so on June 4, 2015, when the couple was picked up and arrested for the alleged possession of over 50 grams of crystal meth or methamphetamine hydrochloride in Torrance, California, that was just possession. That was just a possession charge. In order to have a conspiracy charge, there has to be some sort of preponderance of evidence or probable cause that they had been engaged in that kind of activity longer than just that one day. It had to have gone back. And so when, because they had Henry Alvendia as their star witness, who was their confidential defendant at the time, and Henry Alvendia was able to say, in 2012, they approached me regarding the distribution of methamphetamine, the government was able to charge them with that charge, which is the one that carries the heftier prison sentence if convicted of it. And so these tapes, and the irony, of course, would be that the one tape that would link everything to a conspiracy would have been the one that should have been taken in late 2012 or early 2013 when Mr. Alvendia said that this meeting happened. And it would appear, and I can't confirm this, I cannot verify this. This is just based on what was on the tapes. But there are a couple of instances where it appears that they, as in Mr. Martinez or Mr. Alvendia, are referring to that 2012 meeting. Is in comments that Mr. Martinez said. I'm sorry, let me just, it's a lot of notes, over 4 hours of listening and sitting on the hard benches that are like church chairs. Mr. Martinez says in the recording, this is what we wanted to do. Remember when you brought that up the last time? And he says, when you brought that up, he's referring to Henry Alvendia. And then the other thing is what Mr. Alvendia says himself in a response to Mr. Black. Before the tape recordings were played, Mr. Alvendia was asked whether Mr. Black asked, did they indicate the original plan, which was referring to 2012? And after a couple sentences, Mr. Alvendia says to Mr. Black, they never indicated doing it before, but they mentioned having 20 pounds in California, which was not the 2012 meeting, and which is not something the federal government has pursued or has investigated. But aside from that, aside from what would be something that the prosecution would probably have to answer to, and the defense certainly will bring it up, that Mr. Alvendia himself explained that the 2012 meeting, the idea wasn't Martinez or Moser's, it was something that he brought up, that he mentioned himself. But aside from that, there's the rest of what is said on these tapes, and it's about 2 hours worth of conversation between Alvendia, Martinez, and Moser, where it was taken over 4 meeting times. It was May 5th, May 8th, May 12th, and May 22nd, all before and in the lead up to the trip to California on May 26th for Martinez and Moser, and I believe the 1st of June or the 2nd of June for Mr. Alvendia. And what is missing, well, I'll tell you what's missing from the tape after I tell you what's on the tapes that were played today. So for the May 5th meeting, you can hear either Moser or Martinez asking questions about wanting to, or they say things about wanting to bring in cargo. They talk about water softener that was brought in, and how that may be something that will work. Mr. Martinez was happy when Mr. Alvendia told both Martinez and Moser that he would be able to take a trip and he would be able to help them. Mr. Alvendia, in answering Mr. Black's or Mr. Perez's question about whether he instructed them or they instructed him, and this is going back to the first meeting, which was not, it was not played for the jury to hear, and the prosecution's reasoning is that you can't really hear what is said, and it's because the conversation was happening in the coffee shop, except that prior to Mr. Alvendia leaving the federal agents and turning on the and after he turned on the audio and video recording, contrary to what Mr. Black said, it was not Ms. Moser's idea to go to the coffee shop. It actually was Mr. Alvendia's or one of the federal agents, because he says on that recording that the meeting that they will be having will be at Scooter World and at the coffee shop next door. So that was something that was planned by, not by the defendants, but by the government side. Other things that were said were, I don't even know when we would be able to get something. Have you seen it there before? And neither Alvendia, Martinez, or Moser are ever specific about what this thing is. And of course, it was always up to the jury to make that determination or to decide what exactly they were talking about in the absence of real evidence or solid evidence that tells them one way or the other. But of course, the government contends it is methamphetamine hydrochloride that they're talking about. The comparisons to the consistency of rock salt is what the government is saying is their smoking gun. And well, let me see if I'm missing anything. There's a lot of stuff here. But I won't bore you with details. I'll put the details in our written report. And other things that we didn't mention yet into a newscast that we'll do later. In the meantime, Johnny and I need to get back into the courtroom because oh, it's done? They're walking out? Oh, never mind. The day in court is over. So I need to go and eat because I'm starving. And I know this is a professional setting, but I'm a human being. Listening to our newscast in this update. This has been anything but a boring trial. This has been a very